The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I knew before I even answered that my life was about to implode. 23 years of being a father teaches you to recognize the sound of catastrophe. It has a particular ring, sharp and insistent, cutting through sleep like a scalpel through skin. Mr. Patterson, this is Linda Kowalski from Child Protective Services. We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding your daughter, Emma. I sat up in bed, the familiar ache in my lower back reminding me why I'd been prescribed the muscle relaxers in the first place. At 52, my body had become a catalog of minor failures. Herniated discs, arthritic knees, hands that cramped when I tried to grip anything too tightly. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would kill me, just the slow erosion of middle age compounded by 30 years of construction work. What kind of concerns? I managed, though my throat felt like sandpaper. Your daughter contacted us yesterday. She's worried about your living situation, Mr. Patterson. She says you're not taking proper care of yourself, that you're living in unsafe conditions. The words hit me like a 2x4 to the chest. Emma, my 16-year-old daughter who lived with her mother in the suburbs 40 minutes away, who visited me every other weekend in this cramped apartment that smelled perpetually of Bengal and the arthritis cream I rubbed into my joints each morning. That's not possible, I said, running my free hand through what remained of my hair. I have help. I have someone who comes in. We'd like to schedule a home visit, Mr. Patterson. Today, if possible. We need to assess the situation firsthand. After she hung up, I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to the sounds of the apartment building coming to life around me. Mrs. Chen upstairs running water for her morning tea. The Ramirez kids next door getting ready for school. Normal sounds. The sounds of people getting on with their lives while mine fell apart. I thought about calling Emma immediately, demanding to know what the hell she thought she was doing, but something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of our last visit, 2 weeks ago, when she'd stood in my kitchen with her arms crossed, surveying the unwashed dishes and the stack of takeout containers I'd been meaning to throw away. "Dad, this is gross," she'd said, not with her usual teenage disdain, but with something that looked disturbingly like concern. "When's the last time you actually cooked something?" "I cook," I'd protested, though we both knew it was a lie. Heating up frozen dinners in the microwave didn't count as cooking, and the gas stove had been broken for 3 months. My landlord kept promising to fix it, but promises were about as useful as a chocolate teapot when you were trying to make a decent meal. "Dad?" She'd turned to face me then, and I'd seen something in her eyes that made my chest tighten. She looked older than 16 in that moment, older and wearier than any kid should look. You can't live like this. But I did live like this, and I'd been managing just fine, or so I thought. Sure, the apartment wasn't exactly house beautiful, but it was clean enough. I had Quinsuela come in twice a week to help with the heavy cleaning, the stuff my back couldn't handle anymore. She did my laundry, scrubbed the bathroom, organized the pills that kept my various ailments in check. I'd hired her 6 months ago, after the divorce was finalized, and it became clear that managing a household on my own was going to be more challenging than I'd anticipated. Quinsuela was efficient and kind, a woman in her 40s who spoke accented English and never judged me for the state of my life. She'd immigrated from El Salvador 15 years ago, had 3 kids of her own, and understood the particular exhaustion that came from trying to hold everything together when your body kept reminding you that you weren't 25 anymore. The irony wasn't lost on me that Emma had called social services on the same day Consuela was scheduled to come. Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, at 9 in the morning. She'd be here in 6 hours, would walk through the door with her cleaning supplies and her gentle questions about whether I'd remembered to take my medications, whether I'd eaten anything besides cereal for breakfast. I hauled myself out of bed and surveyed the apartment with fresh eyes, trying to see it the way Emma had, the way some social worker would in a few hours. The living room wasn't too bad. I'd vacuumed on Sunday, and Consuela had straightened up the magazines and beer bottles. The kitchen was another story. I'd let dishes pile up again, and the broken stove gave the whole room a neglected air that I'd grown accustomed to, but that might look alarming to an outsider. My phone buzzed, a text from my ex-wife, Rebecca. Emma told me what she did. We need to talk. Of course she knew. Emma probably called her mother the moment she hung up with social services, probably sat in her pristine suburban kitchen with its granite countertops and functioning appliances, describing her father's pathetic living situation to the woman who'd once shared his bed and his dreams. Rebecca and I had been married for 18 years. We'd met in college, both of us studying business, both of us convinced we were going to conquer the world. She'd gone on to become a successful real estate agent, selling million-dollar homes to clients who appreciated her attention to detail and her ability to make even the most run-down property look like a palace. I'd dropped out junior year when she got pregnant with Emma, had taken a job with my uncle's construction company to support my new family. It had seemed like the right thing to do at the time, the honorable thing. Rebecca could finish her degree while I worked, and then, maybe later, I'd go back to school, get that business degree, become the kind of man who wore suits to work instead of steel-toed boots. Later never came. The construction industry boomed. I made good money, and there was always another project, another deadline, another reason to put my own dreams on hold. By the time Emma started school, the idea of me going back to college felt absurd. I was 34 years old, had a mortgage and a family to support, and Rebecca was already climbing the ladder at her firm. The marriage had died slowly, like a plant that nobody remembered to water. Not from any great betrayal or dramatic confrontation, just from the gradual realization that we'd become strangers living in the same house. She wanted dinner parties with her colleagues. I wanted to collapse on the couch after 10 hours of manual labor. She worried about the thread count of our sheets. I worried about whether my knees would hold out for another decade. When Emma turned 14, Rebecca sat me down at the kitchen table of our suburban split level and explained, in the same patient tone she used with difficult clients, why our marriage wasn't working anymore. "We're not happy, Michael," she'd said, using my full name the way she did when she was trying to be serious. "Neither of us. Emma can see it, and it's not fair to her." She wasn't wrong. Emma had been walking on eggshells around us for months, careful not to mention anything that might trigger one of our increasingly frequent silences. She'd taken to eating dinner in her room, claiming she had homework, but I'd catch her sometimes watching us through the doorway, her face tight with worry. The divorce had been civilized, even friendly. We'd divided assets fairly, agreed on joint custody, promised to put Emma first in all our decisions. Rebecca kept the house. She could afford the mortgage on her own, and it made sense for Emma to have stability. It moved into this apartment in a complex 20 minutes away, close enough to stay involved, but far enough to give everyone space to adjust. For the first year, the arrangement had worked well. Emma spent weekdays with her mother, weekends with me. We'd go to movies, order pizza, play board games that reminded us both of simpler times. She'd seemed to adjust to the new reality better than either of her parents, displaying a resilience that both impressed and worried me. But something had shifted in recent months. Maybe it was her growing awareness of the differences between her two homes, or maybe it was typical teenage development. But Emma had started looking at me differently, not with the easy affection of childhood, but with a more critical eye that cataloged my failures with uncomfortable precision. The apartment felt too small when she was here, too quiet when she wasn't. I tried to make it homier, bought plants that died within weeks, hung pictures that looked lonely on the white walls, installed a big screen TV that dominated the living room like an altar to my loneliness. But I was 52 years old and had never lived alone in my adult life. The silence was deafening. That's when the pills had started. Not anything dramatic, just the muscle relaxers for my back, sleep aids for the insomnia that had plagued me since the divorce, something for anxiety that my doctor had prescribed after I'd mentioned feeling stressed. All legal, all reasonable, all properly labeled with my name and dosage instructions. But pills have a way of multiplying when you're not paying attention. The muscle relaxers helped with my back, but made me drowsy, so I'd started drinking more coffee during the day, which made it harder to sleep at night, which meant I needed the sleep aids, which left me groggy in the morning, which made the anxiety worse, which made the doctor suggest increasing the anxiety medication. I wasn't an addict. I followed the dosages, mostly. I didn't buy pills off the street or doctor shop for prescriptions. But there were mornings when I'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror, counting out the various pills into my palm, and wonder when taking care of myself had become so complicated. Consuela had noticed, of course. She'd started organizing my medications into a pill dispenser, the kind with compartments for each day of the week. "Is easier this way, Mr. Michael," she'd said in her careful English. "You no forget, you no take too many." I'd been grateful for her help, but also embarrassed. When had I become the kind of man who needed someone else to organize his pills? When had I stopped being competent enough to manage my own basic needs? By 7:30, I'd showered, dressed in clean jeans and a flannel shirt that didn't have any stains, and made a half-hearted attempt to tidy the kitchen. Consuela arrived at 9 sharp, as always, letting herself in with the key I'd given her 3 months ago. "Buenos dias, Mr. Michael," she called from the entryway. "You are up early today." She was a small woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, dressed in scrubs that suggested she might have another job at a hospital or nursing home. She had the kind of quiet efficiency that came from years of taking care of other people, and she never asked intrusive questions about why a relatively young man needed so much help with basic housekeeping. "Consuela," I said, following her into the kitchen, "we might have visitors today. Someone from social services. My daughter. She's concerned about how I'm living." She paused in the middle of unpacking her cleaning supplies, a bottle of dish soap in one hand. "Social services? They think you are not taking care of yourself?" "Apparently." She looked around the kitchen, taking inventory of the unwashed dishes, the broken stove, the general air of neglect that I'd grown blind to over the months. "You have been taking your medicines?" "Yes." "You have been eating?" I gestured toward the collection of takeout containers on the counter. "Enough." She frowned, the kind of expression my mother used to give me when she caught me in a half-truth. "Mr. Michael, when they come, you tell them I help you. You tell them I am here twice every week, I clean, I organize your pills, I make sure you are okay. See?" "Yes, thank you, Consuela." She nodded briskly and went to work, attacking the kitchen with the kind of focused determination that had probably helped her survive 15 years in a country where she had to rebuild her entire life from scratch. Within an hour, the dishes were clean, the counter scrubbed, the broken stove looking less like a fire hazard and more like a temporarily inconvenient appliance. The social worker arrived at 11, a thin woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a clipboard that seemed to contain the weight of bureaucratic judgment. Linda Kowalski looked exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play a social worker. Professional but approachable, wearing sensible shoes and a sweater that suggested she spent her days dealing with people in crisis. "Mr. Patterson, thank you for seeing me on such short notice." I led her into the living room, where Consuela was running a dust cloth over the television. She looked up and smiled politely. "This is Consuela," I said. "She helps me with housekeeping." Linda nodded at Consuela, then took a seat on my couch, balancing her clipboard on her knees. "I want to start by saying that Emma seems to be motivated by genuine concern for your welfare. She's not trying to get you in trouble. She's worried about you." "What exactly did she tell you?" Linda consulted her notes. "She described the apartment as messy and depressing, said you're eating mostly takeout because your stove doesn't work, mentioned that you seem to be taking a lot of medication, and expressed concern that you're isolating yourself from friends and family." Each item on the list hit like a small punch to the gut, not because it was untrue, but because it was true in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. "I'm managing fine," I said. "As you can see, I have help with cleaning, I eat regularly, I take my medications as prescribed." "May I see your medications?" Consuela appeared from the kitchen carrying the pill organizer she'd set up for me. "He take these every day," she said, setting it on the coffee table. "I make sure he no forget." Linda examined the organizer, noting the various compartments filled with different colored pills. That's quite a few medications. Are you seeing multiple doctors? My primary care physician prescribes most of them. The muscle relaxers are from an orthopedist. Everything's legal and prescribed. I'm not questioning the legality, Mr. Patterson. I'm concerned about the complexity of managing all these medications, especially if you're dealing with depression or anxiety. I'm not depressed. The words came out more defensively than I'd intended. I'm divorced and dealing with some physical issues, but I'm not depressed. She made a note on her clipboard. Emma mentioned that you don't have many visitors, that you don't seem to maintain social connections. My daughter visits every other weekend. I talk to my ex-wife regularly. I have Consuela here twice a week. I'm not some hermit. But even as I said it, I could hear how hollow it sounded. When was the last time I'd had a friend over? When was the last time I'd gone out for drinks after work, or attended a family barbecue, or done any of the things that normal people do to maintain connections with the world around them? The truth was, I'd been drifting away from my old life ever since the divorce. My married friends didn't know how to handle my new status. I was a reminder that their own marriages might be more fragile than they'd assumed. My single friends were mostly younger guys from work who wanted to hit bars and chase women half their age, activities that held no appeal for a man whose body ached by 7 p.m. and who had to be up at 5:30 for work. Linda spent another hour going through my apartment, checking the refrigerator, mostly empty except for beer and expired condiments, examining the broken stove, which she documented with photos, and asking gentle but pointed questions about my daily routine. Consuela followed us around, occasionally interjecting to explain her role in keeping me functional. Mr. Patterson, Linda said as she prepared to leave, I want to be clear that we're not looking to disrupt Emma's custody arrangement. She lives primarily with her mother, visits you regularly, and by all accounts, you're a loving father who's never put her at risk. Then what's the problem? The problem is that Emma is worried about you, and frankly, after seeing your living situation, I can understand why. You're obviously struggling to maintain your household, you're dealing with multiple health issues, and you appear to be somewhat isolated socially. She handed me a business card and a pamphlet titled Resources for Single Parents. I'm going to recommend some services that might help. There's a support group for divorced fathers that meets twice a month. There are also programs that can assist with meal preparation and home maintenance for people dealing with chronic health issues. After she left, I sat on my couch with her pamphlet and business card, feeling like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. Consuela finished her work in silence, then came to sit beside me. "Mr. Michael," she said quietly, "your daughter, she loves you very much." I know. Sometimes when we love someone, we worry too much. We see problems that maybe are not so big. And sometimes we don't see problems that are actually huge. She patted my hand with her small, calloused fingers. "You are not a bad father. You are not a bad man. You are just, how you say, going through difficult time." That evening, I called Emma. She answered on the second ring, her voice small and defensive. "Dad? Hey, kiddo. We need to talk. I know you're mad at me." I closed my eyes, trying to find the right words. "I'm not mad, Em. I'm confused and hurt, maybe, but not mad." "I was scared," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "When I was there last weekend, you seemed so, I don't know, lost, like you weren't really there." She wasn't wrong. I'd been going through the motions of our visit, putting on the movies she wanted to watch, ordering the pizza she liked, but I'd felt disconnected from it all, like I was watching someone else's life through a window. The pills made everything feel muffled and distant, and the effort of pretending everything was fine had been exhausting. "The lady who came today, she seemed nice," I said. "She was. When I called them, I thought maybe they could help somehow. I know you have Consuela, but Dad, she's not family. She's not someone who really knows you." And you think I need someone who really knows me? I think you need to remember who you are. Because the dad I visited last weekend, that wasn't you. That was someone who looked like you and sounded like you, but it wasn't really you. Her words hit harder than anything Linda Kowalski had written on her clipboard. Out of the mouths of babes, my mother would have said. Sometimes it took a 16-year-old to see what adults were too polite or too professional to articulate. Emma, I want you to know that I'm trying. The divorce, living alone, my health problems, it's all been harder than I expected, but I'm not giving up. I know you're not giving up, Dad. That's not what scares me. What scares you? I'm scared you're disappearing. Like, piece by piece, you're just fading away. After we hung up, I sat in my living room as the sun set outside my windows, thinking about disappearing. It was an oddly accurate description of what the past year had felt like. Not dying exactly, but becoming less substantial somehow, less present in my own life. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 8 months. Instead of heading to the construction site where I spent my days installing drywall and trying to ignore the constant ache in my lower back, I drove to the office of Dr. Patricia Hammond, the psychiatrist my primary care physician had referred me to 6 months earlier. I'd been to see her exactly twice, both times leaving with a new prescription and the vague promise that I'd schedule a follow-up appointment. Dr. Hammond was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and a direct manner that reminded me uncomfortably of my ex-mother-in-law. She didn't accept insurance, which meant each visit cost me $200 I could barely afford, but she was the only psychiatrist in town with openings for new patients. "Mr. Patterson," she said when I appeared in her waiting room without an appointment, "this is unexpected." "I need to talk to someone," I said. "My daughter called social services on me yesterday." She gestured toward her office. "Come in." Her office was decorated with the kind of generic inspirational artwork that you'd find in any professional building, but her desk was covered with family photos and personal touches that suggested she actually spent significant time in this space. She had children, grandchildren, a life that extended beyond the parade of troubled people who sat in the chair across from her desk. "Tell me what happened." I explained about Emma's call, about Linda Kowalski's visit, about the growing realization that I'd been managing my life poorly without really noticing. Dr. Hammond listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "How many medications are you currently taking?" she asked when I finished. 6, 7 if you count the vitamins. "And how do they make you feel?" I considered the question. Numb, mostly, like everything's happening in a distance. "That's not surprising. You're dealing with a significant medication load, and some of these drugs can interact in ways that affect mood and cognition. When did you last feel like yourself?" The question caught me off guard. When had I last felt like myself? Not the medicated, exhausted version of Michael Patterson who went through the motions of his daily routine, but the actual person I'd been before everything started falling apart. "I don't remember," I admitted. "It's been a while." "Michael, I want to suggest something that might sound counterintuitive. I think we need to consider reducing your medications, not increasing them." "But my back will hurt, yes, and you might have trouble sleeping for a while, and you'll probably feel more anxious initially. But right now, you're treating symptoms without addressing the underlying issues that are causing them." She leaned forward, her hands folded on her desk. "You're dealing with a major life transition. Divorce, living alone for the first time in your adult life, aging, chronic pain, financial stress, concerns about your relationship with your daughter. Those are significant challenges that can't be solved with pills. So what do I do?" You start by accepting that feeling uncomfortable is part of the process. You're not supposed to feel fine right now. Your life has been turned upside down, and it's normal to feel lost and overwhelmed. Over the next hour, we developed what she called a reduction plan. We'd gradually decrease the dosages of my medications over the next 6 weeks, starting with the sleep aids and working our way through the anxiety medication and muscle relaxers. She gave me strategies for managing the withdrawal symptoms, techniques for dealing with chronic pain that didn't involve pharmaceutical solutions, and a referral to a support group for divorced men over 40. "I want to see you weekly during this process," she said as I prepared to leave. "This isn't something you should do alone." "I can't afford weekly sessions." "We'll work something out. Maybe we can do some sessions over the phone or extend some appointments to cover more ground. The important thing is that you don't disappear completely while you're trying to reappear." That afternoon, I called the number for the divorced father's support group. It met Thursday evenings in the basement of a Methodist church 15 minutes from my apartment. The man who answered the phone had a gravelly voice and a slight southern accent. "First meeting's always free," he said. "After that, it's $10 a session to cover coffee and donuts. We're not fancy, but we're honest." Thursday evening, I found myself in a circle of folding chairs with 7 other men ranging in age from their early 30s to late 60s. They looked like me, tired, slightly bewildered, dressed in the kind of casual clothes that suggested they were still figuring out how to dress themselves without a woman's input. The group leader was a man named Frank who'd been divorced for 4 years and had the relaxed confidence of someone who'd survived his crisis and come out the other side. He had the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work, and when he smiled, the lines around his eyes suggested he'd learned to find humor in situations that had once seemed insurmountable. "We've got a new face tonight," he said when I introduced myself. "Michael, you want to tell us what brought you here?" I explained about Emma's call to social services, about the realization that I'd been barely functioning for months, about the gradual recognition that I'd been disappearing from my own life. As I talked, I noticed the other men nodding in recognition. These were guys who understood the particular shame of having your own child worry about your competence as an adult. "How long since your divorce was final?" asked a man named David, who looked to be about my age. 8 months. "Jesus," said another man, Tom. "You're still in the thick of it. First year's brutal." "When does it get better?" I asked. Frank laughed, but not unkindly. "That's like asking when you stop missing a leg that got amputated. You don't stop missing it, exactly, but you learn to walk differently." Over the next 2 hours, I listened to stories that sounded eerily familiar to my own. Men who'd thrown themselves into work to avoid dealing with the emotional wreckage of their marriages. Men who'd medicated themselves into numbness rather than face the reality of starting over in middle age. Men whose children had become worried about their father's ability to function as independent adults. "The thing nobody tells you," said a man named Pete, who'd been divorced for 3 years, "is that being married changes you in ways you don't realize until you're not married anymore. I didn't know how to grocery shop for one person. I didn't know how to cook for myself. I didn't even know what I liked to watch on TV when nobody else was around to compromise with." "And the quiet," added David. "Nobody warns you about the quiet." They all nodded at that. The quiet was something we all understood. Not just the absence of another person's voice, but the absence of all the small sounds that make a house feel alive. No one else's footsteps, no one else's breathing. No background hum of another person's life intersecting with your own. "My ex-wife used to leave the TV on for background noise," Tom said. "Drove me crazy when we were married. Now I leave it on all the time, just so the apartment doesn't feel so empty." As the meeting wound down, Frank handed me a photocopied list of survival strategies that had been compiled by group members over the years. Some of them were practical: how to meal prep for one person, how to maintain a cleaning schedule when you're the only one who'll notice if things get messy. Others were more emotional: techniques for dealing with loneliness, strategies for staying connected with your children when you're not living with them full-time. "The most important thing to remember," Frank said as we stacked chairs, "is that this is temporary. Not the divorce, that's permanent. But this feeling of being completely lost and incompetent, that passes. You'll figure out how to be a single man again. Might not be the same as you were before you got married, but you'll be someone." I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the artificial optimism that came from pharmaceutical intervention, but genuine hope based on the recognition that other people had walked this path and survived. The next few weeks were harder than I'd anticipated. Reducing my medications meant that all the physical and emotional pain I'd been masking came rushing back with a vengeance. My back hurt constantly, I slept poorly, and I found myself cycling through emotions with an intensity that felt almost adolescent. But I also started to feel present in my life again. Colors seemed brighter, food had actual taste, and conversations with Emma felt more genuine and connected. She noticed the change immediately. "Dad, you seem different," she said during our first weekend visit since the social services incident. "Different how?" "I don't know. More here." She was right. I was paying attention again, which meant I was also noticing things that needed to change. The broken stove, for instance, which I finally bullied my landlord into repairing by threatening to break my lease. The isolation, which I addressed by accepting Frank's invitation to grab beers after the support group meetings. The general neglect of my living space, which Consuela and I tackled together with an enthusiasm that surprised both of us. "Mr. Michael," she said one Tuesday morning as we rearranged my living room furniture, "you are looking much better, more like person, less like ghost." 3 months after Emma's call to social services, Linda Kowalski made a follow-up visit. The apartment looked different, cleaner, more organized, but also more lived in. I'd bought real furniture to replace the hand-me-downs I'd been using, had hung artwork that actually meant something to me, had stocked the refrigerator with ingredients for actual meals. "This is quite an improvement," she said, making notes on her clipboard. "I've made some changes." "I can see that. How are you feeling about those changes?" "Harder," I said honestly, "but better, more like myself." She recommended that the case be closed, noting in her report that I demonstrated significant improvement in self-care and had developed a support system that included both professional help and peer support. Emma, she noted, had reported that her father seemed more like his old self during recent visits. That evening, I called my ex-wife for the first time in months for a conversation that wasn't about logistics or Emma's schedule. Rebecca sounded surprised to hear from me, but not unpleasantly so. "Emma said you're doing better," she said. "I'm trying. It's been harder than I expected." "The divorce?" "Everything. Living alone, figuring out who I am when I'm not half of a couple, being a good father when I can only see her every other weekend." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "You know, Michael, I worried about you after we separated. You seemed to just shut down. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how without making things more complicated." "I wouldn't have accepted help from you anyway. Too much pride." "And now?" "Now I'm learning that accepting help isn't the same as admitting failure." We talked for an hour, the longest conversation we'd had since before the divorce. Not about getting back together, that ship had sailed, but about co-parenting, about supporting each other as Emma navigated her own challenges, about the strange intimacy that comes from having shared a life with someone even after that life has ended. "She was right to call social services," Rebecca said before we hung up. "Emma?" "Yes, it took courage to do that. She was scared you were going to disappear, and she didn't know how else to help you. She's a smart kid. She gets that from both of us." 6 months later, I was still attending the support group meetings, still seeing Dr. Hammond once a month, still taking some medications, but in much smaller doses and with greater awareness of their effects. I'd started dating occasionally, nothing serious, just coffee with women I met through friends or online, tentative steps toward the possibility of companionship again. Emma had noticed the changes in ways both large and small. She looked forward to our weekend visits again, no longer approaching my apartment with the wary concern of someone checking on an invalid. We cooked together, using the repaired stove to make elaborate meals that we'd eat while watching movies and talking about her life, her friends, her plans for college. "Dad," she said one Saturday afternoon as we made homemade pizza, "I'm sorry I called social services on you." "Don't be sorry. You did the right thing. But it must have felt like I was betraying you. I stopped spreading sauce on the pizza dough and looked at her. She was taller than her mother now, with Rebecca's sharp intelligence and her own particular brand of adolescent wisdom. In 2 years, she'd be heading off to college, beginning her own journey toward independence, and I wanted her to remember this version of her father, the one who'd learned to take care of himself, the one who was present and engaged in his own life. There's a difference between betrayal and intervention. Betrayal is when someone hurts you for their own benefit. Intervention is when someone risks hurting your feelings because they're worried about your well-being. How do you know the difference? You look at the motivation. Were you trying to hurt me or help me? Hurt you. Then it wasn't betrayal. It was love. She smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile I'd seen from her in over a year. So you're not disappearing anymore? No, kiddo, I'm not disappearing anymore. That night, after Emma had gone to bed in the small second bedroom I'd finally furnished properly, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea instead of a beer, thinking about the strange journey of the past year. I'd lost a marriage, nearly lost myself, and discovered resources I didn't know I possessed. I'd learned that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, that vulnerability could be a form of strength, and that sometimes the people who love you see things you can't see yourself. The apartment was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the oppressive silence of isolation, but the peaceful quiet of solitude. There's a difference, I'd learned, between being alone and being lonely, just as there's a difference between managing your life and actually living it. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "Good meeting tonight. See you Thursday." Another from Consuela. "No forget take medicine tomorrow, Mr. Michael. See you Tuesday." One from Rebecca. "Emma seemed really happy when I picked her up. Thank you for being such a good dad." And finally, one from Emma herself, sent from the bedroom 10 feet away. "Love you, Dad. Sleep well." I looked around my apartment, truly looked at it, not with the critical eye of someone expecting judgment, but with the satisfied gaze of someone who'd created a space that reflected who he actually was rather than who he thought he should be. It wasn't perfect. The furniture was modest, the decorations sparse, the kitchen still bore the scars of months of neglect, but it was home, and more importantly, it was mine. The pills I'd take tomorrow morning were organized in Consuela's daily dispenser, but now I knew what each one was for and how it affected me. The support group meeting on Thursday was marked on my calendar, not as an obligation, but as something I looked forward to. Dr. Hammond's business card was in my wallet, but I no longer felt like I was drowning and she was my lifeline. Now she was simply one part of a support system I'd learned to build and maintain. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of the apartment building settling into sleep around me. Mrs. Ryder-Crez's television murmuring through the thin walls, the Ramirez kids being hushed by their parents, the general symphony of people living their lives in close proximity. Normal sounds, comforting sounds, the sounds of a community that I was finally allowing myself to be part of again. I thought about calling my brother Jim in Phoenix, something I'd been meaning to do for weeks. We'd grown apart after my divorce, not from animosity, but from the simple fact that I'd withdrawn from most of my relationships during the worst of my isolation. Jim had left 3 voicemails over the past month, each one a little more concerned than the last. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow, I'd call him back and maybe even admit that I'd been struggling, that I was getting help, that I was slowly figuring out how to be myself again. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken a 16-year-old girl to save her father's life, or that she'd done it by essentially reporting him to the authorities. Emma's call to social services had felt like a betrayal at the time, but now I could see it for what it really was, an act of desperate love from a daughter who watched her father disappearing and didn't know any other way to pull him back from the edge. I finished my tea and went through my evening routine, checking that the doors were locked, turning off the lights, setting out my work clothes for the morning. Simple tasks that had felt overwhelming just months ago, but that now grounded me in the rhythm of ordinary life. I was getting up at 5:30 tomorrow to frame a house with a crew of guys who'd welcomed me back from whatever dark place I'd been occupying. My back would ache by noon, but I'd earned that ache through honest work, and I'd managed the pain with ibuprofen and stretching instead of hiding from it behind a pharmaceutical fog. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the framed photo on my nightstand. Emma, at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on my shoulders at a construction site where I'd been working on a shopping center. She was wearing my hard hat, which was comically oversized on her small head, and we were both covered in sawdust. I'd been 39 then, still married, still convinced that life would follow the trajectory I'd planned for it, still young enough to believe that love and good intentions were sufficient armor against the various ways that life could break you. Now I knew better, but strangely, that knowledge felt like wisdom rather than defeat. Life had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. The cracks were still visible, would always be visible, but I'd learned to live with them, even to find a kind of beauty in the way they'd forced me to rebuild myself more thoughtfully. My phone rang just as I was about to turn off the bedside lamp. Emma's ringtone. "Dad, sorry to call so late. I couldn't sleep. Everything okay?" "Yeah, I wanted to tell you something. When I called social services, I was really scared. Not just about you, but about what would happen if they thought you were unfit or whatever. I was afraid they might try to keep me from seeing you. But you called anyway." "Yeah, because I thought losing the dad I knew was scarier than losing the dad you were becoming." Her words hit me with the force of absolute truth. She'd risked losing me entirely rather than watch me disappear gradually, and that kind of courage, from anyone, but especially from a 16-year-old dealing with her own adolescent challenges, humbled me completely. "Emma, I need you to know something. What you did saved my life. Not dramatically, not like pulling me from a burning building, but you saved the life I was supposed to be living, the one I'd forgotten how to live. I love you, Dad." "I love you too, kiddo. Now get some sleep. You've got school tomorrow." After she hung up, I lay in bed thinking about the strange mathematics of family love, how it could be both unconditional and demanding, how it could inspire both tremendous selflessness and terrible selfishness, how it could be the thing that saved you and the thing that most terrified you. Emma loved me enough to risk our relationship to save it, and I loved her enough to do the hard work of becoming someone worth saving. The alarm would go off in 7 hours. I'd shower, take my carefully managed medications, eat actual breakfast instead of coffee and leftover pizza, and drive to work where I'd frame houses for families who were just beginning their own complicated journeys. Some of those families would make it, their love proving stronger than the various pressures that would test it. Others would crack under the strain. And 10 or 15 years from now, some man my age might find himself living in an apartment like this one, trying to figure out how to be himself again after decades of being half of something else. But that was their story to write. Mine was still being written, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one phone call to social services at a time. And for the first time in over a year, I was awake for the writing of it, present for my own life, grateful for second chances, and 16-year-old daughters who loved their fathers enough to intervene when intervention was required. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the building around me, the sounds of other people living their lives, making their choices, building their own version of home in whatever circumstances they'd been given. Tomorrow, I'd see Consuela, who'd ask about my medications and my meals and my general well-being with the matter-of-fact care of someone who understood that we all need help sometimes. Tomorrow, I'd work alongside men who knew that physical labor was as much about endurance as strength, that showing up consistently mattered more than being perfect. Tomorrow, I'd call my brother and rebuild another connection I'd let atrophy during my period of withdrawal from the world. And Thursday, I'd sit in a circle of folding chairs with other men who were learning the same lesson I was learning, that starting over in middle age wasn't a failure of your first attempt at adulthood, but simply the recognition that life was longer and more complicated than any of us had anticipated when we were young, and making plans based on the assumption that everything would go according to those plans. The last thing I thought about before falling asleep was Emma at 7, wearing my hard hat and laughing as I carried her around a construction site. She'd trusted me completely then, had known with absolute certainty that her father was strong enough to carry her anywhere she wanted to go. Now, at 16, she'd proven strong enough to carry me when I couldn't carry myself, and wise enough to know that sometimes loving someone means refusing to let them disappear, even when, especially when, they've given up on their own visibility. In the morning, I would wake up in my apartment that smelled like cleaning products and fresh coffee instead of loneliness and pharmaceutical fog. I would take my medications mindfully, eat breakfast at my small kitchen table while reading the news on my phone, and drive to work through neighborhoods where other people were starting their own days with whatever combination of hope and resignation they'd managed to cultivate. I would be present for all of it: the ache in my back, the satisfaction of honest work, the brief conversations with coworkers who'd stopped asking if I was okay because they could see that I was working on it. I would be visible in my own life again, substantial enough to cast a shadow, engaged enough to be counted on. And when Emma visited this weekend, she would find a father who was neither the medicated ghost she'd worried about, nor the invulnerable hero she'd believed in as a child, but something more valuable and more real. A man who'd learned to take care of himself well enough to take care of the people he loved. A father who'd discovered that vulnerability shared with the right people becomes strength. A human being who'd found his way back from the edge of disappearing entirely. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd been given, and I was finally awake enough to live it.